Book 4. A Poet at Sea. We are the pawns, and heaven is the player. This is plain truth, and not a mode of speech. We move about the chessboard of the world, then drop into the casket of the void. Umar Khayyam. Chapter 36. In the ochre dusk of a walled garden, there was a groaning crowd. How was I going to recognize Baskerville? Everyone's face was so brown. I leaned against the tree, waiting and watching. The doorway of a lighted cabin had been made into an improvised theater. The Rose Khawan, storyteller and mourner, was drawing out the tears of the faithful along with their shouts and their blood. A man stepped out of the shadows, a volunteer for pain. His feet were bare, his torso naked, and he had a chain wound around each hand. He threw the chains up in the air and let them fall behind his shoulders onto his back. The chains were smooth, bruising and pummeling his flesh, but it did not give. It took 30 to 50 strokes for the first blood to appear as a black spot, which then started pouring out in fascinating spurts. It was the theater of suffering, the age-old game of the passion. The beating became more vigorous as his noisy breathing was echoed by the crowd. The blows went on, and the storyteller spoke louder to make his voice carry over the sound of the flagellation. Then an actor sprang up and threatened the audience with his saber. His grimaces first attracted curses and then volleys of stones. He did not stay on the scene for long. Soon his victim appeared, and the crowd gave out a roar. I myself could not hold back a shout, for the man dragging himself along the crowd had been decapitated. I turned horrified to the Reverend. He reassured me with a cold smile and whispered, "It is an old trick. They get a child or a very small man, and on his head they place a sheep's head, which is turned upside down so that its bloody neck points upward. Then they wrap a white cloth around it with a hole in the appropriate place. As you can see, the effect is transfixing." He drew on his pipe. The headless man hopped and wheeled around the stage for minutes on end until he gave up his place to a strange person in tears. Baskerville. I gave the Reverend another questioning look. He did no more than raise his eyebrows enigmatically. The strangest thing was that Howard was dressed as an American, even sporting a top hat, which struck me as irresistibly amusing in spite of the pervading atmosphere of tragedy. The crowd was still yelling, lamenting, and as far as I could see, no one else's face showed the least hint of amusement except the pastor's. Finally, he deigned to enlighten me. There is always a European in these funeral rites, and curiously, he's one of the goodies. Tradition has it that a Frankish ambassador at the Umayyad court was moved by the death of Hussein, the supreme martyr of the Shiites, and that he showed his disapproval of the crime so noisily that he himself was put to death. Naturally, there's not always a European to hand who can appear in the spectacle, so they use a Turk or a light-skinned Persian. However, since Baskerville has been at Tabriz, they always call upon him to play this role. He plays it splendidly, and he really cries. At that moment, the man with the sword came back and pranced boisterously around Baskerville, who stood still and then flicked his hat off, revealing his blonde hair, which was carefully parted to the left. Then, with the slowness of a zombie, he fell to his knees and stretched out on the ground. A beam of light lit up his clean-shaven child's face and his cheekbones, which were puffed up with tears, and a nearby hand threw a cluster of petals onto his black suit. I could not hear the crowd any longer. My eyes were riveted to my friend, and I was waiting anxiously for him to get up again. The ceremony seemed to go on forever, and I was impatient to retrieve him. An hour later, we met a round bowl of pomegranate soup at the mission. The pastor left us alone, and we ate amid an embarrassed silence. Baskerville's eyes were still red. It takes me a while to become a Westerner again. He apologized with a broken smile. Take your time. The century has just begun. He coughed, brought the hot bowl to his lips, and became lost again in silent thought. Then haltingly he said, "When I arrived in this country, I could not understand how grown and bearded men could sob and work themselves up over a murder committed 1200 years ago. Now I have understood. If the Persians live in the past, it is because the past is their homeland, and the present is a foreign country where nothing belongs to them. Everything which is a symbol of modern life and greater freedom for us, for them is a symbol of foreign domination. The roads, Russia, the railways, telegraph, and banking system. England, the postal service, Austria-Hungary. And the teaching of science. That's Mr. Baskerville from the American Presbyterian Mission." Exactly. What choice do the people of Tabriz have? To send their children to a traditional school where they learn by rote the same misshapen phrases that their ancestors were repeating back in the 12th century, or to send them to my class where they receive an education which is the same as that of young Americans, but in the shadow of a cross and a star-spangled banner? My students will be better, the more adept and the more useful for their country, but how can we prevent the others from seeing them as renegades? In the very first week of my stay, I asked myself that question, and it was during a ceremony like the one you have just been watching that I found the solution. I had mingled with the crowd, and groans were being emitted all around me. Watching those devastated faces, bathed in tears, and gazing at those haggard, worried, and entreating eyes, the whole misery of Persia appeared to me. They were tattered souls besieged by never-ending mourning. Without realizing it, my tears started to flow. Someone in the crowd noticed. They looked at me and were moved, and then they pushed me toward the stage where they made me act out the role of the Frankish ambassador. The next day, my students' parents came to see me. They were happy that they could now answer the people who had been reproaching them for sending their children to the Presbyterian mission. I have entrusted my son to the teacher who cried for the Imam Hussein. Some religious chiefs were irritated, but their hostility toward me can be attributed to my success. They prefer foreigners to behave like foreigners. I understood his behavior better, but I was still skeptical. So, for you, the solution to Persia's problem is to join in with the crowds of mourners? I did not say that. Crying is not a recipe for anything, nor is it a skill. It is simply a naked, naive, and pathetic gesture. No one should be forced to shed tears. The only important thing is not to scorn other people's tragedy. When they saw me crying, when they saw that I had thrown off the sovereign indifference of a foreigner, they came to tell me confidentially that crying serves no purpose, and that Persia does not need any extra mourners, and that the best I could do would be to provide the children of Tabriz with an adequate education. Wise words. I was going to tell you the same thing. Except that if I had not cried, they never would have come to talk to me. If they had not seen me crying, they would never have let me tell the pupils that this Shah was rotten and that the religious chiefs of Tabriz were hardly any better. Did you say that in class? Yes, I said that. This young beardless American, this young teacher at the Presbyterian mission denounced both the crown and the turban, and my students agreed with him. So did their parents. Only the Reverend was outraged. Seeing that I was perplexed, he added, "I have also spoken to the boys about Khayyam. I told them that millions of Americans and Europeans had made his Rubaiyat their bedside book, and I had made them learn Fitzgerald's verses by heart. The next day, a grandfather came to see me. He was very moved by what his grandson had told him, and he said, 'We too have great respect for the American poets.' Naturally, he was completely unable to name a single one, but that makes no difference. It was his way of expressing his pride and gratitude. Unfortunately, not all the parents reacted in the same way. One of them came to complain to me. In the pastor's presence, he yelled at me, 'Khayyam was a drunkard and an impious man.' I replied, by saying that you are not insulting Khayyam but praising drunkenness and ungodliness. The Reverend almost choked on the spot. Howard laughed like a child. He was incorrigible and disarming. So you hail everything they accuse you of. Might you also be a son of Adam? Did the Reverend tell you that too? I have the impression that you both spoke a great deal about me. We have no one else in common. I will not hide anything from you. My conscience is as pure as that of a new babe. About 2 months ago, a man came to see me. He was a huge man with a mustache, but quite timid. He asked if I could give a talk at the Anjuman, the club of which he was a member, and you will never guess on what subject. On Darwin's theory. I found the matter amusing and touching, given the atmosphere of political upheaval which reigns in this country, and I accepted. I gathered together everything I could lay my hands on about Darwin. I set out the theories of his detractors. I think that my performance must have been boring, but the room was crowded and they listened to me religiously. After that, I went to other meetings on more diverse subjects. There is an immense thirst for knowledge among these people. They are also the most determined constitutionalists. Sometimes I would pass by their meeting hall to hear the latest news from Tehran. You ought to meet them. They dream of the same world as you and I. Chapter 37. In the evening, few stalls stayed open in the Tabriz bazaar, but the streets were alive and men were sitting around talking at the crossroads, setting up circles of wicker chairs and of kalyan pipes, whose smoke was gradually displacing the thousand smells of the day. I followed close on Howard's heels as he turned from one alley into another without a second glance. From time to time, he would stop to greet the parent of one of his students, and the street urchins everywhere stopped their games and scattered as he passed. We finally arrived in front of a gate which was almost eaten away by rust. My companion pushed it open, and we went through a small overgrown garden and up to a mud brick house whose door, after 7 raps, opened creaking onto a huge room which was lit up by a row of storm lamps hung from the ceiling, in which a draught of air was swaying ceaselessly. The people present must have been used to it, but I very quickly felt as if I was on a board of flimsy raft. But I could no longer focus on anyone's face and felt the need to lie down as soon as possible and close my eyes for a few moments. Baskerville was not unknown to the Sons of Adam meeting. He caused quite a stir when he walked in, and as I had accompanied him, I also had the right to some fraternal embraces, which were duly redoubled when Howard revealed that his arrival in Persia was partly due to me. When I thought it was time for me to sit down again against a wall, a large man stood up at the end of the room. He had a long white cape draped over his shoulders, which set him apart from the others as the most eminent person in the meeting. He took a step forward toward me. "Benjamin!" I stood up again, took 2 steps and rubbed my eyes. "Faisal!" We fell into each other's arms with an oath of surprise. Mr. Lesage was a friend of Sayyid Jamaluddin. Immediately, I stopped being a distinguished visitor and became an historic monument, or even a religious relic. People came up to me with awe, which was quite embarrassing. I presented Howard to Faisal. They knew each other only by reputation. Faisal had not been to Tabriz for more than a year, even though it was his birthplace. Moreover, there was something unusual and unsettling about the whole evening, together with Faisal being there within those flaking walls and under those dancing lights. Was he not one of the leaders of the Democratic Party in Parliament, a pillar of the constitutional revolution? Was this the moment for him to be away from the capital? These were the questions which I put to him. He appeared embarrassed. However, I had spoken quietly in French. He looked furtively at the men next to him, and then by way of an answer he said, "Where are you staying?" "In the caravanserai in the Armenian quarter. I shall come to see you during the night." Toward midnight, we met again, 6 of us in my room. They were Baskerville, myself, Faisal, and 3 of his companions whom he introduced hurriedly for reasons of secrecy, only by their first names. You asked at the Anjuman why I was here and not in Tehran. Well, it is because the capital is already lost as far as the constitution goes. I could not state it in these terms to 30 people. I would have caused panic. But that is the truth. We were all too stunned to react. He explained. 2 weeks ago, a journalist from St. Petersburg came to see me. He was the correspondent of Rayesh. His name is Panov, but he writes under the pseudonym Taneh. I had heard about him, and his articles were often quoted in the London press. He's a social democrat, Faisal continued, and an enemy of Tsarism, but when he arrived in Tehran some months ago, he managed to hide his beliefs, worked his way into the Russian legation, and by some chance or other, or even by some plan, he managed to lay his hand on some compromising documents, including a project for a coup d'etat, which the Cossacks would carry out in order to reimpose an absolute monarchy. It was all written down in black and white. The underworld was to be given free rein in the bazaar in order to sap the merchants' confidence in the new regime, and some religious chiefs were to address petitions to the Shah asking him to invalidate the constitution by reason of its being against Islam. Naturally, Panov was taking a risk in bringing me these documents. I thanked him for them and immediately asked for an extraordinary meeting of Parliament. Having exposed the facts in detail, I demanded that the Shah be dismissed and replaced by one of his young sons, that the Cossack brigade be broken up and the clerics incriminated in the documents be arrested. Several speakers came up to the dais to express their indignation and to support my proposals. Suddenly, an usher came to inform us that the ministry plenipotentiary of Russia and England were in the building and that they had an urgent note to convey to us. The session was suspended and the president of the Majlis and the prime minister went out. When they returned, they looked like death. The diplomats had come to warn them that if the Shah were deposed, the two powers would consider themselves regrettably obliged to intervene militarily. Not only were they getting ready to strangle us, but we were being forbidden to defend ourselves. Why such resolve? Baskerville asked, appalled. The Tsar does not want a democracy within his borders. The very word parliament makes him tremble with rage. But even so, that is not the case with Britain. No, except that if the Persians managed to govern themselves in an adult manner, that could give ideas to the Indians, and England would then just have to pack its bags. Then there's oil. In 1901, a British subject, Mr. Knox d'Arcy, contained for the sum of £20,000 sterling the right to exploit oil reserves throughout the Persian Empire. So far, production has been insignificant, but a few months ago, immense reserves were found in the Bakhtiari tribals area. Doubtless you have heard talk of this already. These reserves could represent an important source of revenue for the country. I therefore asked Parliament to revise the agreement with London so that we might obtain more equitable conditions. Most of the deputies agreed with me. Since then, the English minister has no longer invited me to the legation. But it is in the legation's gardens that the Bast is taking place, I said pensively. The English consider their Russian influence is currently too great, and that Russia is only leaving them the congruent portion of the Persian cake, so they encourage us to protest and open their gardens to us. It is even said that they were the ones who pointed the photograph which compromised Monsieur Naus. When our movement triumphed, London managed to obtain an agreement from the Tsar to share the country. The north of Persia would be the Russian zone of influence and the south would be the private property of England. Once the British got what they wanted, our democracy suddenly ceased to interest them. Like the Tsar, they can only see it as an inconvenience and would prefer to see it disappear. By what right? Baskerville exploded. Faisal gave him a paternal smile before carrying on with his account. After the visit of the two diplomats, the deputies were disheartened. They were unable to confront so many enemies at the same time and should do no better than to lay the blame on the unfortunate Panov. Several speakers accused him of being a forger and an anarchist whose sole aim was to provoke a war between Persia and Russia. The journalist had come with me to Parliament, and I had left him in an office near the door to the Great Hall so that he could give his testimony should it be necessary. Now the deputies were asking for him to be arrested and delivered to the Tsar's legation, and a motion had been put forward to that effect. This man who had helped us against his own government was going to be handed over to the executioners. I, who am so calm by nature, could no longer hold myself back. I jumped up onto a chair and shouted like one possessed. I swear by the soul which covers my father, that if this man is arrested, I will call the sons of Adam to arms and set this parliament awash in blood. No one who votes for this motion will leave here alive. They could have lifted my immunity and arrested me too, but they did not dare. They suspended the session until the next day. That very night, I left for the capital, for my birthplace, where I arrived today. Panov came with me and is now hiding somewhere in Tabriz while waiting to leave the country. We talked, and soon dawn surprised us. The first calls to prayer sounded, and the light became brighter. We debated and constructed 1,000 gloomy futures, and then debated again, too exhausted to stop. Baskerville stretched out, stopped in full flight, consulted his watch, and stood up again like a sleepwalker and gave his neck a thorough scratch. My God, it's already 6, a night with no sleep. How can I face my pupils? And what will the Reverend say seeing me come back at this hour? You can always pretend that you spend the night with a woman. Howard, however, was no longer in the mood to smile. I do not want to speak of coincidence, since chance did not play a large role in the affair, but I am duty-bound to point out that, just as Faisal finished his description of the plot being hatched against the young Persian democracy, based on the documents which had been spirited away by Panov, the coup d'état had already begun. In fact, as I later learned, it was toward 4 o'clock in the morning of that Wednesday, 23 June 1908, that a contingent of 1,000 Cossacks, commanded by Colonel Lyakov, set off toward Beheritizan, the seat of parliament in the heart of Tehran. The building was surrounded and its exit under guard. Members of a local Anjuman who had noticed the troops' movements ran over to a neighboring college where a telephone had recently been installed in order to call some deputies and certain religious Democrats such as Ayatollah Behbani and Ayatollah Tabatabi. They all came before dawn to indicate by their presence their attachment to the Constitution. Curiously, the Cossacks let them through. Their orders had been to prevent anyone leaving, not entering. The crowd of protesters kept swelling, and at daybreak there were several hundreds of them, including numerous sons of Adam. They had rifles, but not much ammunition, about 60 cartridges each, certainly not enough to enable them to withstand siege. Moreover, they were hesitant about using their arms and ammunition. They effectively took up position on rooftops and behind windows, but they did not know whether they should fire the first shots, thereby giving the signal for an inevitable massacre, or whether they should wait passively while the preparations for the coup were carried out. It was precisely that which delayed the Cossacks' assault even longer. Lyakov, surrounded by Russian and Persian officers, was busy stationing his troops as well as his cannons, of which 6 were counted that day, the most lethal one being installed on Tobakhana Square. On several occasions, the colonel rode within the defenders' line of sight, but the personalities present prevented the sons of Adam from opening fire lest the Tsar use such an incident as a pretext for invading Persia. It was toward the middle of the afternoon that the order to attack was given. Although the sides were unequal, the fighting raged for 6 or 7 hours. By a series of bold strokes, the resistors managed to put 3 cannons out of action. However, this was the heroism of despair. By nightfall, the white flag of defeat was raised over the first parliament in Persian history. But several minutes after that last shot, Lyakov ordered his artillery to fire again. The Tsar's directives were clear. It was not enough to abolish the parliament. They also had orders to destroy the building which had accommodated it, so the inhabitants of Tehran would see its ruins, and it would be forever a lesson to all.